G'day. In my last video I was asked a couple of questions about parting off. Now I part off and it's one of those trickier things that it takes a little bit of practice and all that sort of thing. But although I wouldn't consider myself an expert, I thought, well, I'll throw together a few tips and methods about how I do things and see if that helps people out. First of all, why is parting such a pain? Well, it comes from what you're trying to do. For a start, if you're trying to part off a piece of bar stock with a parting tool, you're actually cutting on quite a wide front. If you think about if you're cutting with another tip, right? The actual contact area there is relatively small. With a parting tool, it's much bigger. Okay. Cutting metal takes horsepower, and so by having that wider thing, it requires more power. Now, there are a couple of things that don't help here. One is that the tip is as wide as the groove, and you might have a little bit of relief in there, but you won't have much. So what can happen is that the swarf that you generate here, the chips, can get stuck in there, and that's not going to help you. Okay, so it's one of those things you need to get the chips cleared out. The other thing is, if your parting blade isn't on, perpendicular to the axis of the lathe there, right? If it's coming in here, exaggerated fashion, yes, it's going to be cutting here, but it's also going to be rubbing here, and that's not going to help, and that'll tend to push the tool over, and you'll get all sorts of problems there. Looking at that picture from a side view, this is another problem you have. If that tool is dead on center, everything will work nicely. The material coming off will, well, fingers crossed, curl away, all that sort of thing. And some parting tools, by the way, have a little thing there just to get that material flowing. However, if your parting tool is set above center, what's going to happen there? It's going to rub. As you push the tool in, right, every so often that'll grab, you'll get a sliver of material come off, and then it'll do it again. So that's one of the problems you get. And so if you're getting it, so it's hard to, you don't seem to be parting much off, you keep turning the handle and suddenly you get a sliver of material off, the chances are that your tool is too high. The tip of that tool does need to be on the center. You can get away with it with a normal tool, particularly if you're on a large diameter, but for a parting tool, it is critical. The other problem you might have is this. If your parting tool is below center, what could happen is that'll be cutting away, but you'll get to a spot, particularly as you start getting in diameter, where this material will want to actually climb up on top of your tool. Okay? It's not made for those sorts of loads. You might snap your tool, you might do all sorts of other damage. You've got to watch that one. So once again, dead center. One thing to watch with this style of parting tool holder, it's got a groove that bottom edge sits in, but the front is only clamped with this one bolt. And so what can happen is if you have any sideways forces, the back of this blade can come out. Now that is the equivalent of having your parting tool going in on an angle. So one day I'm going to get round to putting a hold down bolt on that, just a strap with a bolt just to push that tail end in and keep that going. This high speed steel parting tool is, I think it's a 1/16 blade. You can get these in a variety of sizes, particularly if you're in the US. Where I got this from, I don't know, so please don't ask. But I find that this one is the one I go to for small diameter pieces, particularly if they're only short, because I feel silly taking a 3mm parting groove out of something which is only 1 millimeter or 2 thick. So yes, that's that one. This is my carbide parting tool. This one's a Tech one, and it's quite nice because you can actually put a little bit of side force on this one. It's designed for that. Most of them it's just straight plunging in. There are other tipped carbide tipped parting tools on the market. As I said, this is just one that I've found, and I quite like it. Every so often I have to replace this blade because I do have a crash on it. But I have found that I can also patch that up a little bit. If it does twist a bit, I can sometimes, you know, straighten it out, which is a nice idea too, because they're not the cheapest things to buy. If you're in Adelaide, the guys down at General Tools can help you with these, but if you're elsewhere, well, they do mail order, I guess, but anywhere who sells the Tag-U-Tech stuff should be able to help you. One of the first things I'm going to do is make sure my parting blade is perpendicular to the axis of the lathe, because if it's not, it'll rub. Now, if I've been using the compound and turned the compound around, or even just slid the tool post back and forth in the T-slot for a larger piece of work, then it might not be. So the way I do that is I just get a steel rule like that and a chuck with a flat surface, and then I just wind that in until I get that so that it is parallel. Right, and that's all there is to it, but you do need to make sure that is parallel. Okay, so now that is parallel to the front of the chuck, it's, unless you've got a strange chuck with a conical surface on it, this will be perpendicular to the axis of the lathe. This is the other bit of setup that you have to do. That cutting tip has to be dead nuts on the centre of this bar. The easiest way I've found of doing that is using a steel rule again, pinching that between the work and the stock. Now, if that's straight on centre, that steel rule will be level. If I just move that up a smidge, you'll see that that's got a bit of a tilt to it, and so that's showing me that that's not square. So you need to have that square. If it's too high, it'll rub. If it's too low, it'll dig. So if you have it square to the material, you're good. Another possible way of doing this is, you can see on the end of the bar stock here, there's a sort of a bullseye pattern. So what you could do is wind in until you've got that in the middle of that. That's not as good. I've also seen some people use it with lines scribed on the side of a tail chuck. Some people make up a special little tool that sits on the carriage and gives you a sort of a step to go on to. Doesn't matter which way you do it, but for parting in particular, you need that tool on centre. It's not so bad when you've got a larger diameter workpiece, but when it's small, that's what's going to cause you some grief. The other thing you need to think about is how rigid is your lathe. Okay, if you've got slop in your gibs so that everything can move around the place, you're not going to have much fun parting. You might be able to get away with it, but typically that movement is going to mean that the tool tip can dig into the material. You've got uneven loading. That can cause you problems. So you need to make sure that primarily your cross slide gib is snug fitting, that the slide is moving quite nicely. When parting, you want to be as close to the chuck or support, whether it's a steady or whether it's even a tailstock support, as you can, because the material will deflect with the forces from the parting. It'll try and push away. Now, what happens is that pushes away the amount that the tool is taking off, and so therefore the force on the tool becomes less. So it speeds up. You beauty, we're all good. Then this springs back, and what's more, it'll go a little bit over centre, so suddenly it'll bog the tool down. So you want to have it so that the material is as well supported as you can. So I've parted off with the tool, basically that close to the chuck. It only just clears here. Please do check that when you're setting up. But I would say maybe a diameter out and you're okay. Any more than that, you need to think about what you're doing. If you're parting something that's particularly deep, you can actually do, a parting cut, move over, say, half a diameter, do another parting cut, and actually make yourself a wider groove. It uses more material, but at least then you don't have this problem where you've got a very deep groove with things getting jammed. Having said that, this is about the maximum distance that this tool will part. There's actually a step on the holder. I do occasionally push that out a little bit if I'm doing something really soft like some plastic, but you can't part very deeply. Well, you can, but it's not advised. So if you've got something, this one sticks out probably about 25 millimeters. So if you've got something over about 50 millimeters, 40 millimeters, you probably need to cut that on a hacksaw and then face that off. Okay. This one here, it's a thinner blade. It's even less. That's probably maybe a maximum of 20 millimeters, and even that is pushing it. One of the reasons for that is that when you're pushing, or when the material is pushing down on that, there's a spring effect that way, but there's also the possibility of this bottom section buckling, and the thinner that parting blade is, the more likely that is to happen. So what will happen is that as the blade gets pushed down, it might twist and then do funny things, bind on the side of the cut or all that sort of stuff. So you're keeping your parting blade as short as it needs to be, and you're keeping it as close to the chuck as you can so you get the maximum rigidity out of it. When parting, you want some lubrication, unless you're doing something like stainless steel or brass that doesn't need it. For aluminium, I use one of these, and I'll squirt that directly into the cut that I'm parting. For steel, I might use that, or I might use some cutting oil on a brush and drip that, or try and get that into the cut. It's no good being around the cut, it has to be in the cut where the tip can get it. And the reason for that is, and particularly with aluminium, the material will try and weld itself to your parting blade. Okay, with aluminium, no oxide, so it's very, very attracted to other things. It'll try and weld itself on there. As soon as it does that, you haven't got a cutting tip anymore, you've got a blob. That'll jam, cause you all sorts of trouble, could even break the tool if you're going. And so lubrication for parting is very important. Doesn't need to be much, but it certainly helps you if you've got some lubrication happening in there. There's my parted off stub. You can see there's a little bit of a, what would you call it, a spigot, something like that of material on there. And that's just because as the parting tool comes in, it gets to a point where that wobbles around and that actually breaks through a sort of a fatiguing mechanism, I guess, rather than cuts. You can put an angle on the tip of your parting tool. That used to be a common thing, particularly on a high-speed steel tool like that, and so have a slight angle which will cut that off and then come along and clean that up. The problem with that is as soon as you put an angle on there, it's going to want to push the tool sideways. And so you have to be careful about that one. I don't bother. I generally, take that off to a sanding disc or a grinder or something if it's critical, and just take that little nub off. You only get it on one side because this side, of course, is held rigidly in your chuck and everything's wonderful. If the parts are going to have a hole in them, you're probably better off putting the hole in there before you do the parting, because what that means is the parting will come along and reach the hole, and so you don't have that problem. In fact, a lot of your problems, the deeper you go, the more problems you're likely to have. And so if you've got a hole in there, so you're only parting through, say, 6 millimeters of material rather than 12, you're less likely to have problems because it's acting more like a normal tool and less like one that's stuck in a trench. The other thing I did when I parted this off was I used power feed. Power feed for me has got a couple of advantages. One of them is it gives me a nice steady feed at a controlled rate. And that's important. If you feed by hand and your feeding isn't beautifully smooth, the tool will feed in a bit too much, bog down, maybe catch and all that sort of thing. And so you could have problems with it not behaving. The other thing is that a lot of the time you don't get a good finish on a parted surface. This isn't too bad, but some of the garden variety steels, they tear up, so you need to make an allowance for that perhaps and flip it over in another chuck to face that off if it's important. But if you're feeding by hand, you may find you've got a bit of an erratic pattern happening on here. But if you can arrange your power feed and use that for feeding in rather than winding by hand, you'll probably come off a little bit better. It's just a matter of finding that nice sweet spot of feed and speed. One final thing about knurling, which I'll just tell you about, because if I don't, someone's bound to say, but what about? Okay. I do all my knurling with the tool on the front tool post. There is a school of thought, and it was very popular back in model engineering circles back, well, I was even reading about it 10, 20 years ago. Having a parting tool mounted on a rear tool post, inverted, so that when you'd finished doing your normal turning work, you then wound the cross slide all the way out. That would bring that blade in and part off. Now, there are a couple of things I don't like about this. I guess the positive thing about it is that it means that you don't necessarily have to have a tool holder on your four-post tool post for a parting tool. But these days, quick change tool posts, that's not really such a major issue. The things I don't like about it are that when you're cutting, parting off conventionally, the force is down on the tool, down onto the ways. That's the way the laser's been designed. When you're parting with a rear tool post, it's actually lifting off the ways. And so if that's sitting on the ways there, you've now got to have some way of restraining that. Otherwise, that might go up and down. You might get a little bit of chatter, all that sort of thing. Right? That's one thing that I don't like about it. The other thing is more, it's a practice thing, and it's a bit like threading it away from the chuck by putting the lathe in reverse and all that sort of thing. This is the way that parting is conventionally done. Don't mind if you do things in other ways, but I do believe that you need to have the basics. So if you're parting off with a rear tool post because you can't part off with a front one, one day you're going to be in a situation where you're around a friend's place or something like that and say, oh, just jump on the lathe and finish off those parts for me, and you'll find you can't because they haven't got their tool post set up like that. So it's another one of those things, a bit like some thread cutting and all those sort of stuff where, fine, set up your tool with a rear parting off blade if you like, but still practice so that you master parting off conventionally. Otherwise, one day you could find that you're stuck. There you go, some collected thoughts on parting. So hopefully there's some stuff in there which is useful to people. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and we'll see you for the next one.